Thank you for joining us again today. We are looking at the noise abatement guidance for the AS350 provided by the Fly Neighborly Committee. We're glad that you're able to take time out of your schedule to watch this. We do look forward to sharing the information with you. Due to a variety of factors, we have a very limited number of panelists today. In fact, Jim Viola, the HAI president, is not here with us today. Our one panelist, I'd like to introduce Juliet Page, who is the chair of the HAI Fly Neighborly Committee. She's also a subject matter expert at the Volpe National Transportation Systems Center. We'll bring her on in just a few minutes. This is an interactive webinar. There are going to be two different question and answer periods today. One will follow the first part of Juliet's presentation. Feel free to use the question module right away if you have questions. Question module should be in the bottom of your screen or on the side of your screen, depending on what kind of screen you're looking at. We try to watch the chat features as much as we can, but it doesn't always work. The question module is by far and away the best. We will do our best to answer as many of the questions as we can. As always, this webinar is being recorded. If you're not able to watch all of it, or if you need to share it, or if you want to go back and review things, you can find it at rotor.org/webinars. Usually it's tomorrow, the next day, could be the Monday following, depending on how quickly the videos are rendered. These should also be emailed out to the attendees as well. I will now take Jim Viola's normal spot and give you our introduction. The sound of helicopter means different things to different people. For instance, during the Vietnam War, the sound of Huey helicopters told wounded soldiers on the ground that help was finally on the way. Many of us today in the industry can immediately hear the difference between different models of helicopters, knowing if the as yet unseen helicopter is a turbine-powered or piston-powered machine, or if it has a tail rotor. And I think a lot of us have seen television shows or movies where the picture of the helicopter on the screen doesn't quite match the sound that we know comes from the camera ship that is filming the air scene to scene. Speaking of Hollywood, if you're old enough, you might remember a television show called Airwolf, which featured a Bell 22, which had some really interesting Hollywood additions. One of those special effects enabled a pilot to flip a switch into whisper mode, making the helicopter fly silently through the skies. Unfortunately, the whisper mode is not real, and the sound of helicopters that makes so many of us turn our heads to the sky is not one that everybody else embraces. The sound of helicopters is one that bothers many, particularly in highly populated areas. Most owners and operators of helicopter businesses are very familiar with the telephone call or email that starts with, "I'd like to make a noise complaint." Our industry is doing some really great things to reduce these noise issues. Our manufacturers designing and building quieter aircraft, doing everything they can to make the helicopters as quiet as possible. Designers are even working on future aircraft, trying to make the electrically powered advanced air mobility aircraft as quiet as possible as well. Until it's possible to create this whisper mode on the helicopter from the television show, it's also up to pilots to reduce the impact of our noise on the communities. Our Fly Neighborly Working Group exists because HAI wants to help the operators fly smarter and reduce the impact of noise on communities. You are here today because you recognize the same thing, and you're making it a goal to reduce the effects of your operations on your neighbors. HAI appreciates that you're making this effort, and we hope that you'll share what you're learning with others who couldn't fit this into their schedule this afternoon. HAI is also grateful to our Fly Neighborly Working Group for developing these aircraft-specific topics. We anticipate more of these webinars in the future for other aircraft, and you'll always be able to find past webinars on other subjects on our website. As part of this program, we want to make certain a few things are clear. First, even though this webinar focuses on one model of helicopter, general Fly Neighborly information that is not specific to each aircraft or any particular airframe is provided at the beginning of each session and is most relevant for all rotorcraft operations. Next, pilots must always operate their aircraft in a manner that's in accordance with OEM flight manuals and company procedures and required performance and safety margins. Flight profiles recommended in this presentation to help mitigate noise signatures should not take precedence, shall not take precedence, must not take precedence over flight manuals, regulatory, or company procedures. Airframe specific testing was funded by the U.S. Department of Transportation and was performed by the Volpe Center. The associated recommendations described here and in the handouts are provided as a courtesy by the HAI Fly Neighborly Working Group and do not reflect OEM provided technical data, views, or positions. So now let's go ahead and get started. I'd like to introduce Juliet Page, Chair of HAI's Fly Neighborly Working Group, who is making today's presentation. Juliet, welcome. Please take it away.
Okay, thanks everybody. Hello and welcome to the Fly Neighborly training module on noise abatement for helicopter approach operations. Part 1 will provide general information on helicopter approach noise and how approach noise abatement guidance is developed for helicopters. Part 2 will cover AS350 specific Fly Neighborly guidance. So I'm going to bring up my slides now and share my screen. I'm in presentation mode and switch here. So I'm going to turn my video off so as not to distract you all and let you look at the slides. Does that look okay?
Looks good, Juliet. Okay.
All right, so we'll get going. So the part 2, we're going to cover AS350 specific approach noise. Just want to mention the training is supported by Helicopter Association International, the Federal Aviation Administration, U.S. Department of Transportation Volpe Center, and the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. And when my screen advances, all right, there we go. So the goal of the training module is to provide you, the helicopter pilot, with the knowledge you need to perform quieter approaches in your operations. The training objectives include providing you with a brief overview of Fly Neighborly, a basic understanding of the key elements of helicopter noise generation, an understanding of what influences the generation of what is known as blade vortex interaction, or BVI noise, during helicopter approach operations and how you can avoid it, up-to-date guidance on the recommended approach noise abatement procedures specific to the Airbus AS350, and some general tips and guidance for conducting Fly Neighborly operations. Now, during the presentation today, I'm going to play several sound recordings that are best listened to with a good pair of computer speakers or headphones, or if you've got a subwoofer, turn it up. Okay, so what is Fly Neighborly? Let's get started with a brief overview. Fly Neighborly was initiated by HAI in the early 1980s and continues to be supported by numerous private and public partners, including the FAA. It's intended to be a holistic approach to mitigating helicopter noise impacts on the community and is more than just noise abatement flight procedures. Operational, geographical, meteorological, emotional, and political aspects all factor into the implementation of Fly Neighborly for a particular helicopter operation. More recently, Fly Neighborly has been incorporated into the iFly Quiet program launched by the FAA, HAI, and the Vertical Flight Society. The iFly Quiet program includes extensive flight testing by the FAA and NASA to develop Fly Neighborly information and flight procedure guidance. It includes the development of additional promotional educational materials, tips, and tools for operators to use for community outreach. And it institutes formal training programs in person at HAI's annual Heli Expo and online under the HAI Online Academy, the FA Wings training programs, and webinars like this. A key objective of the Fly Neighborly and iFly Quiet is to provide you, the helicopter pilot or operator, with the tools needed to successfully address your community noise issue. The Fly Neighborly Toolkit includes guidance on noise abatement flight procedures, route planning, and other operational considerations and opportunities for reducing noise impacts. Fly Neighborly and iFly Quiet programs also provide techniques to help you conduct effective community outreach to foster better relationships between you and the communities in which you operate. So a fairly extensive set of resources have been developed for iFly Quiet and the Fly Neighborly program. We won't go through these now. This slide will be available in the handout for all course participants. When you receive it, please save it or print it and keep it for future reference, and be sure to check out all of those links. So with iFly Quiet support, the HII Flight Enabling Program provides general tips and recommendations for quieter helicopter operations, in addition to model-specific noise abatement guidance. And a downloadable flyer is available on the HII website. As a participant in today's training, you'll receive an electronic copy of the slide for your future reference. Several of these general tips are relevant to conducting fly neighborly approaches. First, descents at less than 50 knots are generally not recommended. The long duration of approaches at these airspeeds can be annoying, independent of the noise levels. Second, routing changes can be as, and in some cases, more effective than flying noise abatement procedures. We'll discuss these further later in the course. Third, straight-in flight is generally quieter than turning flight during approaches, though turns during approaches may be desirable if the resulting route avoids noise-sensitive areas. Finally, when executing turns during approaches, turning away from the advancing side of the main rotor is typically quieter than turning into it, and level turns are generally quieter than descending turns. Okay. So the objective of this section is to provide a basic understanding of helicopter noise and in particular helicopter approach noise. Key elements include an overview of the primary source noise generated by a helicopter in takeoff, cruise, and approach, an understanding of blade vortex interaction noise, the dominant helicopter source noise during approaches. Helicopter noise is complex. It is typically rotor noise dominated with multiple source noise mechanisms that typically emit noise with varying characteristics in different directions. These noise sources include thickness noise. Thickness noise is due to displacement by the rotating rotor blade. It trends with both rotor speed and blade thickness. It is emitted in the plane of the rotor in the forward flight direction and is typically most important for cruise mode. High speed or impulsive noise, HSI noise, is a noise associated with the formation of shocks on the main rotor blades near the tips. It's also emitted in the tip path plane and projects forward of the aircraft. HSI noise typically only occurs at high forward speeds or low ambient temperatures for helicopters designed with higher blade tip speeds. Blade vortex interaction, or BVI noise, typically only occurs during descent conditions and can be emitted below the rotor tip path plane, both forward and aft of the aircraft. This rotor source noise is generally the primary component of approach noise and will be covered in greater detail in this training module. Rotor blade loading noise and non-tonal broadband noise are projected out of the rotor tip path plane of the rotors. They are an unavoidable byproduct of the air loads on the main and tail rotor and rotor blades due to the generation of lift. All of these noise sources are evident for both main and tail rotors, but usually only loading and broadband noise come into play for tail rotors. Tail rotors typically is not a factor for helicopter approach noise. Helicopter approach noise is typically dominated by BVI. The pop-pop sound of very intense, impulsive BVI noise is also referred to as blade slap. The presence and strength of BVI noise during descent is determined by airspeed, rate of descent, with more intense BVI occurring at specific airspeed and descent rate combinations that unfortunately often coincide with normal approach airspeeds and descent rates. Conversely, airspeed and descent rate conditions can be identified that emit little or no BVI noise to provide noise abatement opportunities. BVI noise is created when a rotor blade passes through or close to the wake structure of a preceding blade. The interaction occurs with the tip vortex shed by that preceding blade, and the intensity of that interaction is determined by the distance and geometry of that tip vortex relative to the rotor blade. BVI noise is a very impulsive noise that is typically directional from the helicopter depending on how and when the interactions occur during the main rotor rotation. BVI noise can travel relatively long distances and trigger high annoyance on the ground. BVI directivity can shift with changing descent condition, changing where the peak impacts are on the ground relative to the helicopter's flight track. Blade vortex interactions on the advancing side of the main rotor generate BVI noise that is directed down and forward of the helicopter. Blade vortex interactions on the retreating side of the main rotor generate BVI noise that is directed downward and rearward of the helicopter. In general, retreating blade BVI is not as critical as advancing blade BVI for noise abatement. Both noise abatement procedures or routing can be effective for reducing approach noise impacts. Because of the strong relationship with airspeed and descent rate, BVI noise is typically the helicopter's most amenable to reduction or elimination by changing flight condition, and hence has long been a focus for the development and implementation of fly neighborly noise abatement procedures, and is the focus of this training module. So here you can see, there you go, a top view visualization of advancing and retreating blade vortex interactions. So the objective of this section is a more detailed understanding of BVI noise emissions during approach and how this understanding is used to define approach noise abatement procedures. Key elements include why BVI noise occurs during some approach conditions, what the deceleration effects are on BVI noise emission during approach, and how noise abatement procedures are defined for avoiding BVI noise based on this information. So when does BVI occur? If you plot noise as a function of airspeed and rate of descent, there's typically a characteristic region of airspeed and descent rate combinations in which blade vortex interactions occur. Often this region is presented as a fairly compact region of peak BVI surrounded by a significantly larger region identified for avoiding BVI noise. The region of descent conditions with significant BVI will hereafter be referred to as the BVI avoid region. The resulting graphic is sometimes referred to as operational noise or fried egg plot. The location extent of BVI noise regions are helicopter model specific. Some helicopter models can have an extended BVI noise region or have more than one BVI noise region with separate ranges of airspeed and descent rates where vortex interactions occur. There will also be differences between BVI noise emissions to the left and right side of the helicopter, with peak BVI noise typically skewed towards the advancing side. Airspeed and descent rate combinations determine the rotor tip, airspeed and descent rate determine the rotor tip path plane and the trajectory of the wake relative to the rotor, both which factor into BVI noise generation. To illustrate this, 3 descent conditions will be shown for 80 knots at descent rates of approximately 150, 500, and 800 foot per minute that start above and end below the BVI avoid region. Typically, a helicopter incurs little to no BVI in level flight or a shallow descent as the wake remains below the rotor. As the wake trajectory moves up into the rotor at moderate descent rates and certain airspeeds, a helicopter can emit strong or intense BVI. Further increasing descent rate can get the wake trajectory above the rotor, so steeper descents, short of auto rotation, but below the BVI avoid region, can incur little or no BVI noise. A comparable sequence occurs for 500 foot per minute descents at 180 and 60 knots for this example case. In addition to changing airspeed and descent conditions, deceleration can be an effective tool to reduce or avoid BVI noise. Past testing has shown that a helicopter can quietly transit its high peak BVI region by decelerating through it. Deceleration significantly increases aircraft pitch altitude as if the helicopter were operating at a higher descent rate or glide slope. So as I click on the play buttons, you'll hear a helicopter approaching both at a constant descent condition in the BVI region and decelerating through the BVI region. Did that sound play okay?
I can hear it, Juliet.
Thank you. So the first one was the red in the middle of the BVI region, and the second one was below it, avoiding most of the BVI. Deceleration can also aerodynamically put a helicopter into its BVI avoid region. This typically occurs when a helicopter is executing a shallow or low descent rate approach, and for some helicopters can actually occur in level flight at lower airspeeds. In this case, the aerodynamically higher descent rate or glide slope because of the increased aircraft pitch attitude puts the aircraft into the BVI avoid region. In general, decelerating during shallow, low descent rate approaches should be executed at 1 knot per second or less to avoid putting a helicopter into its BVI region. If the BVI noise is evident, try further reducing the deceleration rate. For some helicopters, however, the BVI avoid region extends too close to level flight for even a slow deceleration to be effective. When the helicopter gets past all noise sensitive areas or gets to an airspeed below the BVI avoid region, deceleration can be set as needed to safely complete the approach and landing. The position and extent of the BVI avoid region, operational considerations, constraints, and safety considerations all factor into the development of approach noise abatement procedures for a particular helicopter model. For example, if altitude and conditions permit you to do so, establishing a descent condition below the BVI avoid region at 600 to 1,000 foot per minute and 80 to 100 knots is likely to be both operationally and acoustically effective. Decelerating past the BVI avoid region can then be executed at any time to complete the approach and the landing procedure. Alternatively, a relatively slow deceleration above the BVI region to 60 knots before initiating the descent could be an effective, albeit longer, noise abatement procedure. A subsequent deceleration to complete the approach and landing for this procedure would be at airspeeds below the BVI avoid region. The size and location of the high peak BVI region is specific to each helicopter model, determining and limiting the available procedures for approach noise abatement. So, takeaways for approach noise. Airspeed, descent rate, and deceleration determine the presence and intensity of the BVI noise during approaches. Every helicopter model has a range of airspeed descent rate combinations with significant BVI. Deceleration effects can help you avoid or put you into high BVI noise. Deceleration generally helps at higher descent rates, but may cause BVI at lower descent rates. Approach noise abatement procedures use combinations of airspeed and descent rate plus deceleration to avoid BVI conditions. So we're at the conclusion of the part 1, and so I'd like to open up the floor and see if anybody has questions at this point.
We did have one question came in, Juliet, but you apparently are doing a great job. You answered the question already. So
all right.
Go ahead and keep on going.
All right, we'll keep plowing ahead. All right, so entering into part 2 now. So this is where we're going to get into the Airbus AS350 specific guidance. So, so the key training objectives for this part are understanding the AS350 operational noise plot developed to show BVI noise versus approach condition, knowledge of the recommendations for the AS350 approach noise abatement procedures, knowledge of left, center, right BVI noise characteristics for the AS350, and understanding how the AS350 noise abatement guidance can be used in routing approaches for improved fly neighborly operations. And we'll be listening to some oral comparisons of the noise abatement and low and high BVI noise approaches. So let's take a look at a more in-depth plot here. A joint NASA FAA noise flight test for the Airbus AS350 was conducted in 2017. Objectives of the test included noise measurements with a large microphone array over a broad range of descent conditions initial identification and testing of potential approach and noise abatement procedures, and maneuver or turns testing. Test outcomes included on-site field observations, ground noise measurements for each approach test point, as well as evaluation of noise abatement procedures. So this is the operational noise plot. It's the latest generation one for the AS350. Red colored contours indicate descent conditions with high BVI noise. The darker the red, the more intense the BVI noise. As the colors change from red to orange to yellow, BVI noise content decreases until there's little to no BVI noise in the sounds. Overall approach noise findings indicate the AS350 operational noise plot include that high BVI noise was observed at airspeeds of 40 to 60 knots for descent rates of 600 to 1,000 foot per minute, as indicated by the gray contour. The peak BVI noise was observed near 40 knots and 800 feet per minute descent rate within the white contour. Descent conditions with significant BVI noise extended well beyond these peak noise contours. For airspeeds above 80 knots, the AS350 plot indicates noise generally increased with increasing rate of descent. We'll discuss why this occurs and some potential implications a little bit later. The levels and range of noise depicted are specific to the AS350 and are not applicable for any other helicopter model. So two key AS350 objectives were identifying a BVI avoid region, the descent conditions to stay clear of to avoid high BVI noise, and a region of effective noise abatement descent conditions to support fly neighborly guidance. Field observations, ground noise measurements and contour plots, and the op noise plot were all used in identifying these regions. The extent of the descent and descent conditions identified as having BVI noise of significance establishes the BVI or avoid region as shown by the red contour and the AS350 operational plot. The BVI avoid region sets minimum airspeeds and descent rates for noise abatement indicated by the solid green lines on the op noise plot. These minimum airspeeds and descent rates include descending at 1,200 foot per minute or greater below 80 knots with a minimum airspeed of 60 knots and 80 knots or higher for descents at less than 1,200 foot per minute. Upper and lower boundaries for the rated descent, as well as an upper boundary for airspeed, are shown as dashed lines on the 350 operational noise plot. These boundaries are soft boundaries intended to approximate practical limits for guidance on the AS350 noise abatement that address safety considerations, passenger comfort, etc. Selection of a noise abatement descent condition using this guidance is at pilot discretion and, as mentioned before, subject to safety and other operational constraints, some of which will be discussed later. For the recommended AS350 fly neighborly approach procedure, first, transition from cruise to a descent condition in the green box. For steeper descents at 60 to 80 knots, transition at 80 knots or higher until your rate of descent exceeds 1,200 feet per minute. Maintain airspeed and descent rate within the green box as long as safe and practical. For approaches at 1,200 foot per minute or greater, decelerate as late and quickly as practical and safe. For shallow approaches at 1,200 foot per minute or greater, for shallow approaches at less than 1,200 foot per minute, a constant descent rate deceleration performed as quickly as practical and safe is recommended when nearer to 1,200 feet per minute. A constant glide slope deceleration at 1 knot per second or less is recommended near to 400 foot per minute or a 3-degree glide slope. To successfully circumvent the BVI avoid region at moderate descent rates nearer to a 6-degree glide slope, your descent rate may need to be increased closer to 1,200 foot per minute or decreased closer to 3 degrees prior to initiating the deceleration. A recommendation to approach and descend as steeply as possible was provided for AS350 noise abatement guidance back in the 1993 Fly Neighborly Guide, and this is consistent with that. So now we're going to listen to several AS350 noise recordings, allowing you to compare the recommended noise abatement operations both with peak BVI condition and with each other. So first I'm going to play a sound recording in the high BVI noise. And now we're going to listen to one in the quiet region. Not exactly whisper mode, but it's a lot closer. And for yucks, we'll play the one in the middle as well. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about practicalities and safety considerations. The AS350 approach noise abatement guidance includes recommendations for executing approaches at higher descent rates or higher airspeeds that require significant deceleration of the aircraft to complete the landing. These higher descent and deceleration rates bring to bear multiple practicalities and safety considerations. Considerations arise from both aircraft capabilities and environmental conditions such as wind conditions or low cloud ceiling. Pilot workload and passenger comfort can be significant considerations for the high descent and deceleration rate approaches recommended for AS350 noise abatement. White knuckle approaches are not the intent of this guidance. With a tailwind, for example, you may have to fight to get the aircraft down when executing a steep descent, particularly if you're initiating the descent from a set waypoint. Second, getting into auto rotation as a normal operating condition is not the intent of this guidance. Maximum descent rate should be limited to avoid going into auto rotation. You should also avoid vortex ring state condition. General FAA guidance on avoiding a vortex ring state is to reduce rated descent below 300 foot per minute prior to your airspeed getting below 300 knots. We have some information that 300 foot per minute may be conservative for the AS350, but we will leave you with the general FAA guidance. Note that potentially it means having to start substantially reducing rate of descent at 40 knots or so to get below your 300 foot per minute as shown on the AS350 operational noise plot. Maximum deceleration rate is set by aircraft capability, but operational considerations, including passenger comfort, will likely limit practical deceleration rates to 2 or 2.5 knots per second. This sets the minimum time requirement needed to decelerate for landing, which in turn sets the minimal starting altitude needed to complete the deceleration, an important consideration for high descent rate approaches. For lower cruise altitudes, deceleration will have to be initiated close to or as soon as possible after achieving a noise abatement descent condition, if not in cruise before initiating the descent. Low cruise altitudes can therefore come into play in limiting available descent rates for noise abatement. For example, if cruise altitude prior to descent is operationally or weather constrained to say 500 feet, safe and practical descent rates may be limited to significantly less than 1,200 foot per minute to have sufficient altitude and time to be able to execute a safe and practical deceleration to landing. For steeper descents from lower cruise altitudes, both reducing airspeed nearly to 80 knots in cruise prior to initiating the descent, as well as setting the airspeed closer to the 60 knot minimum for noise abatement, may be necessary to provide sufficient time to decelerate the aircraft prior to completing the landing. So next we're going to discuss left, center, right approach noise characteristics of the AS350. So a 3-wedge geometry on the ground was defined to evaluate the left, the center, at or near the flight track, and the right side noise characteristics. This wedge geometry is centered on the red arrow representing the flight path or the track into the landing pad. The boundaries of the center wedge and the ground are fixed so that what constitutes the lateral extent, as well as what is far left and far right for the side wedges, is dependent on how steep an approach is executed. For moderate approaches near 6 degrees, the lateral extent of the center wedge will be approximately plus or minus 45 degrees out or down from the helicopter. Note that the outer boundaries of the side wedges are not hard boundaries. Although noise further decreases past the side wedges, results obtained for the side wedges will be applicable for some distance past the side wedges as well. So this slide shows summary plots of the left, center, right noise, along with the NASA operational noise plot. These left, center, right plots are intended to show additional directivity BVI noise trends with changes in airspeed and rate of descent. Several key takeaways come from the comparison of the left, center, and right noise data trends. First, the highest BVI noise occurs in the center wedge. Significantly lower noise was observed to the left and the right, with the overall lowest noise found on the right side of the AS350. Second, AS350 BVI noise generally decreases with increasing airspeed in all directions. Third, above 80 knots, center and right BVI noise is fairly constant with descent rate, but left side noise increases with descent rate. This result may in large part explain the increase in noise with increasing descent rate observable above 80 knots on the operational noise plot on the top left, indicating that unless key noise sensitive areas are located to the left of the approach path, the increase shown on the wide area op noise plot is not really of concern for noise abatement. Finally, for airspeeds below 80 knots, all three directions in general show BVI noise first increasing, then decreasing with increasing descent rate, similar to the op noise plot. Several key takeaways for the 350 noise abatement come from comparison of the left, center, and right noise data. First, peak noise occurs in the center wedge, so avoid approaches directly over or near noise-sensitive areas when possible. Second, when practical, route your flight operation to keep noise-sensitive areas to the far left or far right of the AS350 during approaches. Third, keeping noise-sensitive areas to the far right of the AS350 can be the most effective option for reducing noise at those locations. Simple AS350 noise recordings are again provided for comparison of the left, center, and right noise for the recommended approach procedures. So we'll click on the symbols to hear the recordings. So I'm going to start in the center in the high BVI noise region. This one right here. Now we're going to listen to the right side for the high BVI noise region. Okay, now I'm going to go back to the center and play one of the lower BVI noise regions for a higher airspeed and descent rate. Oopsie. And we'll listen to the comparable condition on the right side of the aircraft. And just to round it out, we will play that same condition on the left side of the aircraft. Okay. Detailed noise abatement guidance helps to define approach routes with enhanced fly neighborly outcomes. In this case, the flight operation currently conducts approaches along a flight track that impacts many residential neighborhoods. Executing AS350 approaches that utilize the recommended noise abatement descent conditions, maintaining cruise altitude as long as possible, then executing a steep and higher airspeed approach may be sufficiently effective. Another option is to reroute the aircraft to take further advantage of topological features in the AS350 approach noise characteristics. A potential alternative flight path to reduce noise impacts follows a major commercial road, makes a level turn around ball fields, and then executes a steeper descent into the helipad over a non-residential area where BVI noise impacts should be reduced. This route does turn into the advancing side of the main rotor against the recommendation to turn away from it, but the turn is executed past the ball fields over what looks like primarily a commercial area, which may mitigate potential impacts. Alternatively, a shallower turn executed before reaching the ball fields could be effective as well, permitting a less steep approach with added building clearance near the helipad. A second potential alternative flight path primarily clears residential areas in level flight or a very shallow descent, makes a level low bank angle turn, then executes a steeper descent into the helipad over what appears to be a non-residential area. Although this turn would be away from the advancing side of the main rotor, the route looks like it would be executed around a school and its playing fields, which could be an issue. These examples are potential routes that would need to be evaluated in further detail, as there are several other considerations that typically need to be addressed, including safety, wind constraints, etc. So we want to leave you with a few takeaways from the training module on the Airbus AS350 approach noise abatement. This includes, for the best AS350 approach noise abatement, establish a descent condition in the green box on the operational noise plot. For steeper noise abatement approaches, decelerate as late and quickly as practical and safe to complete the landing. Also reduce the descending rate to 300 foot per minute or less below 40 knots before going below 30 knots. For shallower noise abatement approaches near to 3 degrees, decelerate at 1 knot per second or less to complete the landing. If possible, avoid approaches over noise-sensitive areas, keeping noise-sensitive areas to the far left or far right if practical. Keeping noise-sensitive areas to the right is in general the most effective way. Keep in mind practical and safety considerations, particularly for executing steeper noise abatement approaches. Safety always comes first. So here's one of the tip sheets that you should be able to obtain at that link. I'll just give you a couple of final thoughts here. Always remember that how, when, and where you fly your helicopter can have significant benefits for reducing noise complaints and increasing community acceptance of your operations. Aeronautical decision-making and standard operating procedures are also important to achieving consistent and safe application of fly neighborly procedures. Standard operating procedures should include noise abatement procedures that reflect local air traffic control, heliport requirements, and incorporate community inputs. More information on aeronautical decision-making and standard operating procedures is provided in the online FAA Wings Fly Neighborly Techniques training. Community outreach is critical to successfully implementing a Fly Neighborly program in your operations. Effective outreach can act as a catalyst in further reducing noise complaints. Don't just implement noise abatement procedures. Tell your community that you are doing it and that you are doing it for their benefit and well-being. Finally, developing and implementing Fly Neighborly is not an exact science. If you first don't succeed, try again. So thank you for taking the Fly Neighborly Approach Noise Abatement training module for the Airbus AS350 helicopter. As always, fly safe out there. And I think we have a little bit of time for some questions.
And Juliet, we did get a bunch of questions in. I'll make sure we leave your references page up for the time being. I will say before I get into the other questions, I had one that occurred to me during your presentation. Are noise complaints unique to the United States, or helicopters operate around the world? Do other countries receive these complaints, and how are they dealing with them?
So they're not unique to the United States. I know for a fact that European countries also get helicopter noise complaints. There are likely things happening around the world. I personally am not aware of them. I don't have specific examples of them. There is an international effort. So through the ICAO, there's a noise working group that is looking at addressing noise abatement procedures and mitigation of noise. And that ICAO has a number of member states, which are essentially different countries around the world, that are participating in that activity. And the Fly Neighborly Working Group has several members that are active through ICAO looking at the addressing of helicopter noise. So it is a concern, and it's being worked on.
Oh, okay. I didn't think we could be completely unique in that. So what can you do if you're still getting noise complaints after implementing recommended Fly Neighborly approach procedures?
So a big portion of this is the communication. There's been stories of operators going out there and reducing their noise by flying mitigation routes, and the community may not have picked up on it, or they're just gung-ho on complaining. But once they held some public meetings and did some outreach and coordinated with them and told them, hey, look, we're doing this. We're flying the long way around to avoid flying over your schools and your parks and in your noise sensitive areas, then the community realized that they were actually stakeholders. And the fact that the operators were giving them control and power to help modify their operations and take their concerns into account it's gone a long way and significantly reduced the noise. Now, it can be scary to get up in front of a community group and talk about noise issues. So that's why through the iFlyQuiet program, we have a whole lot of material out there that, PowerPoints and other information that you can use to bring to communities. Maybe you don't want to meet in person, but there's information and tips that you can provide that they can include in their, community newsletters and things like that. So, or on your Facebook page or what have you. So there's a multitude of resources so that operators don't need to reinvent the wheel. We have that available. If you go to the Fly Neighborly website, there are links to all of those kinds of resources for you.
We have a question from one of our regulars, Gabriel Amato. Welcome again, Gabriel. And I'm going to steal your screen share from you in just a second, Juliet, because we saw this one coming. Can you tell us more about the advanced acoustic model software that is available through Volpe?
Yeah, so the AAM software tool is a simulation model. It has at the core of it what we call noise spheres, which essentially is a sphere around the helicopter that has the information that goes out in all directions from the helicopter for each operating condition. What you do is within the tool, you can create a flight trajectory. You prescribe a flight path and flight conditions, descent rates, what have you. And you're basically giving it a trajectory. And with the appropriate noise data, it will propagate that down to the ground and allow you to visualize your noise footprint. You can create animations, and you can look at a whole variety of acoustic metrics and I'll spare you any more details, but you can totally geek out on it.
Okay, well, we appreciate that, Gabriel. And there we go. And from Anthony De La Pena, is there an app that I may download and thus utilize on my iPad, which will help me during pre-flight and in-flight operations and will identify these conditions? And let me start by saying, Anthony, we, HAI and Flight Neighborly, don't recommend ever looking down during approaches or anything like that. Please use your iPads judiciously, just like you would in a car.
He said pre-flight planning.
He did say pre-flight and in-flight operations. So yeah, we need to make sure
right.
that we.
There is not one available that I am aware of right now. That is a fabulous idea. And I hope there are some sponsors out there listening to that.
We did have one staff recommendation. I'm not sure who made it, but something called Help Sheet could be a possibility.
Okay.
From Mark Kleinens, will later models of the AS350, that being the B3E and H125, develop a bigger or different noise plot since they have a much higher shaft horsepower rating?
That's a good question, and I don't have an answer to that. My inclination is that it's going to depend on what the rotor system looks like. If they're at higher loading, but utilizing the same RPM and operational flight conditions, the geometry would be similar, but the intensity might be louder. But I'd really have to go into the specifics of that particular vehicle. We have not measured those, so I can't say, I'm sorry.
Maybe that'll be a future webinar for us. I appreciate the fact that you folks are at the Flight Neighborly Group and Volpe are looking at all the different aircraft models too, in order to help make the operators a little bit more neighbor friendly. From Kevin Neiman, such high descent rates makes me really nervous. Vortex is the main concern here, as slowing the rate of descent will require high power as your speed drops. And so I'm not entirely certain the question. It looks like it's more of a comment, but is that something you can address? Such high descent rates makes him nervous. Vortex is the main concern, as slowing the rate of descent will require high power as your speed drops.
Yeah, so that is a concern, and we have recommended that you obviously stay within the manufacturer limits. We do provide some of the alternate ways of getting around the high BVI noise section and the op noise plot. If there are some considerations like that where you're not comfortable in certain regions, or if it's too sporty of a ride for your passengers as well. You can reduce some of the speed and descent rates, but be wary of moving into the high noise region. So there are areas in the plot where you can do some pre-flight planning and figure out how to navigate from your high altitude and high speed down to the low altitude and the lower speeds for landing. So there's a multitude of ways to go around through the plot. So you can look at that in your pre-flight planning and come up with alternates, which may not be the quietest, but they are quieter.
Well, we have a somewhat related question from Daniel Peterson, and it seems like a low descent rate is quieter than a high descent rate per the chart, but you didn't discuss it. Is that strategy mitigated by having to fly lower over a populated area for a longer period of time?
So yes, you do need to take into account duration. The red plots, the wide area operational noise plots, do include a duration component to them. The blue and the green plots, the dot plots for the right, center, left, those are only identifying the BVI max. So where the BVI maximum exists, those do not take into account a duration adjustment. So if you're looking for broader area, wide area noise reduction, and you want to account for transversing over a larger area and duration effects, you're better off probably using the guidance in the red wide area operational noise plot and using the blue and green right, center, left for guidance in a particular area if you have individual noise sensitive receptors that you absolutely don't want to hit with BVI noise.
From Jason Jones, do winds significantly affect the noise abatement areas of your rotor?
So wind affects the effective flight path angle of the aircraft. So they could potentially move you, depending on if it's a tailwind or a headwind, they can move you to a different effective flight path angle. So on the operational noise plots, we show the 3, the 6, and the 9 degrees. So depending on what your wind condition is, remember the acoustics and the emission is the local relative where the velocity vector is, where your rotor is, and where the wake is going. So it's all relative to the local helicopter, and it's geometrically dependent. If you think back to that animation we showed, it all has to do with where the wake is relative to the blades.
Okay, and looks like we've only got one more question at the moment. So if you are waiting to ask your question, probably now is the best time to do it. Otherwise, we may have to wrap up. But from Jason Jones, specifically, if I'm changing my approach path for noise abatement and would therefore be approaching with a crosswind, are the left, right, center noise areas still the same?
So you can think of it as the wind is going to blow them to the right or to the left. I mean, to a lesser degree. You will have some effects aerodynamically on the noise emission at the source, but in general, the propagation of the footprint is going to essentially blow in the wind to a certain degree. So if there's a critical area and you're trying not to put it directly under track, if you have a wind blowing from the right, you may need to, adjust one way or the other to give yourself a little bit of extra margin there. So yes, the wind will affect it.
Okay, well, we did have one final question that came in a little bit earlier regarding wings credit. And I do want to take this opportunity to let everybody know we did register this webinar with the FAA for wings credit. Somebody asked if it was based on the registration report. No, it's based on the attendance report. So those of you who are watching this live are the ones that we can submit to the FAA for the wings credit. You should not need to do anything else. Sometimes it doesn't hurt, but I think you should be covered. Check your file here shortly. I'm not sure what the normal turnaround for credit time is. Juliet, I want to thank you so much for you and the Fly Neighborly team, the people at the Volpe Center, the Department of Transportation, for putting this webinar together. The presentation was fantastic. It really brings home the impact of noise when you can literally hear the difference moving left to right under different conditions, just how much you can make it a quieter flight for the neighbors.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure. I hope everybody got something out of it. If you have extra questions, you can always reach out to us through the Fly Neighborly Working Group, and we're happy to help you understand this material. And kudos also to FAA for sponsoring a lot of this work, and NASA as well. Is a real team effort. And personally, I'm thrilled to be able to take all of this science and engineering and try to get it into the hands of operators and have you guys hopefully make some good out of it instead of it just living in a journal somewhere. So thank you all.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to seeing you or another member of the working group for the next webinar, probably in August, I believe. That's what we were looking at. So thank you so much for joining us. We'll just have a few housekeeping deals or issues that I'll wrap up with. Here we go. Do want to remind everybody, don't forget to download the Fly Neighborly help sheet. I'll leave this up on the screen for just a second in case you missed it earlier. If you want to do a screen capture, print screen, if you want to grab your camera out of your pocket to get a picture of the address, just go ahead and take this chance to download it. We will have it as a download available on the Fly Neighborly site. We will also have it available as a download available on the webinar site. For those of you who are watching the video recording later on, you should be able to still receive this. The website will remain live as well. So there's plenty of ways for the people who are watching it to get it downloaded. We also invite you to stay on top of other VTOL news and issues. Visit Rotor Media for Rotor Daily e-newsletter that sums up that day's VTOL news, as well as Rotor Magazine, produced by and for the VTOL industry. I'm not sure if I can do this on my screen. There's a brand new one that just, it's not going to do it on this background, but there's a brand new rotor that just hit the streets in print and electronically on the website. There's a couple of great ways to download that. You can download it as a PDF or as an electronic file, so you can read it at your convenience. We can also have Rotor Media come to you. Visit rotor.org/subscribe for your free subscription downloads to the Rotor Daily e-newsletter. That's aggregated news from around the world about what's going on in the helicopter industry. We also have Rotor Magazine print and online quarterly. You can subscribe to that, actually have it delivered directly to your home in print. It's free to the US and North American residents. There is a delivery fee for international residents, but it's not too much. We also have the new Rotor Now app, putting the latest VTOL news on your phone. You should be able to find that in your iPhone or Samsung store, the Google store. Save the date. This one hopefully is going to come through next week, July 22nd. Recognition of HAI Salute to Excellence Golden Hour Award, which recognizes achievements in airborne medicine, and a discussion on using drones on airborne medicine. This will honor the University of Maryland UAS test site. They were one of the first organizations to successfully accomplish an organ transplant flight using a drone. And so we want to recognize them for that. We're also hoping to have a discussion on the future of drone use in airborne medicine. There will be a follow-up questionnaire coming to you shortly. We do ask that you spend a few minutes filling that out. We appreciate hearing what you've liked, what you don't like, and if you have suggestions for future webinars. We do pay attention to that. If you have something else you'd like to address that HAI can help you with, or that you have a complaint about, we'd like to hear about that too. Best way to do that is through the email president@rotor.org. Those go directly to Jim Viola, our HAI President and Chief Executive Officer. He does see every one of them, and he does task our staff with the responsibility to respond to those. We do look forward to hearing your feedback. And that does wrap us up for this week. We do appreciate that you took the time to join us. We know that this is a busy season in the Northern Hemisphere. We also know that the time zones don't always work out right. So we appreciate that you took the time to join us either live or watching the recording. We invite you to visit rotor.org webinar for more information on this or any of the other webinars. We are in the process of updating our website, and that should make it easier to search our past webinars very, very soon. Until next week, we ask that you be safe, that you fly neighborly, and we'll see you next week.